Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to watch the worst punishments in human history by Good Enough. I assume that the rat cage is going to be in here. You know, that torture method where they take a rat, put it in a bucket or something, just some sort of metal cage, and then they put it on your body and then the rat just eats through you. I assume that's going to be here. I can't imagine many things which could be worse than that, but maybe I'm wrong. So let's see. Link to the original video will be down in the description below.
Let's start with the bad and slowly work our way towards the stuff of nightmares. Number 10, the Rat Dungeon. If you were alive in London
Okay,
in
something
during
with
the
rats,
medieval
just
period,
not
you
what
would
I
have
was thinking.
definitely heard about the Rat Dungeon, since this punishment struck paralyzing fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. This was a cell that was located at the bottom of the London Tower, where prisoners were shackled and chained in complete darkness. But here's the thing, the dungeon was connected to the nearby river and just below the river's water
So then the
line,
rats
so
would
that
just
when the
come
water
in?
levels rose, all the rats that lived along the riverbed would be pushed out of their shelters and forced to swim downstream. This would of course lead the hungry and angry rats
The
towards
rats
the entrance
just-
of the
they
dungeon,
just
where
eat
they
you
would then come
alive.
face to face with the prisoner. But to the unlucky prisoner, he
Is that
never
worse than
actually
the
saw
metal
anything,
cage?
and all he would hear were the soft scurries of the rat's feet entering the dungeon. And in a
that
matter
would
of
be
minutes,
horrifying.
these soft noises were in the hundreds and all around him. These angry and aggressive rats would then begin to take small bites from the prisoner, who had no way of defending himself. Now he might be able
Imagine
to shake the
being
rats
eaten
off
alive
for
by
a few
rats.
hours, but eventually the prisoner would pass out from pure exhaustion. And while he slept, the rats would continue to take bites from his flesh. Eventually,
can't
when he
stay
would
awake
wake up,
forever.
he would discover hundreds of
Especially
bites
if you have
throughout
no
his
food or
entire body.
water.
But it didn't stop there. The prisoner was left here for days or weeks on end, depending on his crime.
So this is
But
just
towards
an
the end of the
execution, not
medieval
even a
period,
punishment.
This form of punishment just got more and more deranged, eventually becoming a form of execution, where prisoners would just be thrown in
Exactly.
the dungeon and forgotten about. Number 9, the rack.
Might as well
This was yet another.
Might as well try and kill yourself by bashing your head in at that point, because you're not getting out anyway.
Another punishment that took place in the London Tower. The rack was a torture device that was used in many places
Oh, the
throughout
rack.
history. This form of punishment was originally
just pull
designed
you
for getting a
apart.
confession, usually from criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war. The device looked like a large ladder,
This
but
would
instead
be
of
a
secure
long and
steps, it would actually
excruciating
rotate
death.
like a rolling pin. You see, when a prisoner was placed on the rack, he would have his feet and wrists tied to a ratchet pulley system. where
He's
two legal
enjoying
officials
it.
would slowly tighten the ropes and locking them in place, placing an increasing amount of strain on the prisoner's shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows with every single turn. This was all done to get information, but of course, a lot of the times the truth was not accepted as reality.
Yeah.
And the prisoner would then begin to say,
I'm not sure who would lie while being tortured like this, but they just didn't believe it, so they kept torturing the people. It really didn't matter if you told the truth or you lied, because you would just be tortured until death anyway.
whatever he believed the officials wanted to hear. Sometimes it would work and the prisoners would be let go, while other times they would be tortured even more for lying. When the
I mean,
whole
even if
ordeal
they
was
get let
over,
go-
prisoners were usually released with dislocated joints.
Yeah,
but
they're still
oftentimes they
gonna
were left completely
suffer.
paralyzed. That was the case in England
So yeah, they're
in
just gonna die anyway.
1447 when a 25-year-old girl named Anne Askew would be tortured on the rack for hours and hours on end and left completely paralyzed after all her joints were dislocated. She was then carried on a chair and burned alive at the stake. All this because she read and memorized
What
scriptures
even-
from the Bible, which she preached in private to a small group of women, which were
Oh
the
my
exact women she
God.
refused to name and expose during her torture. You see, during
Props
this
to
time
her.
period, if you followed any religion other than
She
the
a real
Catholic
one,
Church,
but
you better not
God.
say a word to anybody, including your own husband, which was the person that turned her
He
in.
sold her
Number
out?
8, keel hauling.
What a
This brutal
dick.
punishment was carried out at sea on sailors who would steal or be violent towards others and would
Oh,
usually
keel hauling.
result in death. Keel hauling would start with a
Yeah, you're not
sailor
surviving
having his
keel
arms
hauling.
tied
No
with a
chance.
rope, then looped around the entire circumference of the ship before being tied off to his feet. The sailor would then be thrown overboard while the group of men on board pulled on the rope to slowly drag him around the outside of the ship, including over the keel, which is how this punishment gets its name. But a lot of the times, the sailor wouldn't even have to worry about it, since they were dead before they ever reached it. Kinda just depends on how hard the guys on the rope feel like working that day. Not only would the sailors be drowning and getting their backs and necks broken on the keel, they were also getting sliced apart like a cheese grater by all the sharp barnacles on the outside of the ship.
Barnacles, yeah,
but
exactly.
if by some miracle a sailor actually happens to make it all the way around the ship,
He would
without
probably die
dying,
from infection.
One of 3 things will happen.
Disease.
1, he would be sent for round 2 and for sure be dead by then. 2, be freed and allowed back on the ship, where he would then slowly die to infections. Or 3, live the rest of his life
There was no
single and
surviving
being made
that.
fun of, since he was now fully covered in scars from head to toe.
I doubt
Number
there was
7,
anybody who
crushed
actually
by
survived that
elephants.
punishment.
Now we are getting to the part of the list where living is no longer an option.
I've never heard of this
form
one.
of punishment has been used by many countries
I feel like
throughout
this one would be
history, but was
pretty
most
quick, though.
recently used by India
It
in
wouldn't
the
be that
19th
painful,
century,
would it?
which is really not that long ago if you really think about it, by India in the 19th century. Which is really not
The
that
19th
long ago
century,
if you
oh,
really
that's
think about
pretty-
it. Like,
well, it's not
your
that
great
recent,
grandma
but
could have witnessed one of these.
it's not that
What
long
type
ago.
of crimes would you have to commit to be crushed by an elephant, you might ask? Well, apparently if you failed to pay your
Murder?
taxes, that was good
Oh,
enough. And
taxes.
of course, stealing or being an enemy soldier was also
Remember,
a great
pay your
way to become
taxes,
a tortilla.
or else you'll be
But
crushed by an
the most disturbing
elephant.
case in history was when the 4th Mughal Emperor of India ordered an enormous amount of criminals to be crushed to death in a single day, simply because he was bored and needed some entertainment. The guy who forgot to pay his taxes, crushed.
This
The
was
man who stole an apple
entertainment
from the local market,
back then.
crushed. The little orphan who jaywalked across the street, crushed. The man who murdered his neighbor and added his remains to a large pot of tomato soup,
He's
and
not
fed
gonna
that
be
soup to
punished.
his family and watched them eat it from the shadows with a creepy smirk on his face. He's alright. Apparently he makes a damn good soup. There are a few ways that this public execution goes down, but one thing always stays the same. There's always a guy on top of the elephant controlling its every move. And this was very intentional, as this was meant to showcase just
Okay.
how amazing the ruling class were. I mean,
How
look
does
at
that
them. They can control an elephant.
Represent that?
I'll
Like,
be impressed. The first method of execution was the one that you better pray for if this was going to be your fate. Here, the criminals would have their arms tied behind their back and their heads placed on a pedestal, where it was then crushed like a grape by the elephant's foot. Now, the second method is much
Imagine
more
how
cruel.
that would
the
look.
criminal would be placed flat on the floor
Oh, not
with
a
their
good
arms
picture.
tied behind
Oh.
their backs. Then the elephants would be guided to walk over the person's body, and hopefully the criminal would die on the first go. But sometimes they just end up crushing a leg or an arm, so the elephant then has
so
to
this
make a U-turn
wasn't
and try
just
again
an execution.
and
This was a
again
show
and
for the
again.
people.
The final and worst way is when a highly
Not
trained
sure who would be
elephant
sick
was
enough to
guided
wanna
to
watch
slowly
that.
crush the person limb
But
by
apparently
limb.
there were some
they would
people
first crush the arms,
like
then the
that.
legs, and then poke holes in them with the tusk until eventually dealing the final blow to the head or torso. This is the more theatrical route that rulers like the 4th Mughal love to take, and made for a truly traumatizing experience for everyone, except for the 4th Mughal. He loved it. Number 6.
How can you enjoy
Probably
that?
one of the grossest and most cruel forms of punishment on the list. This has been used by a few countries throughout history, but was most recently used in Egypt in the 17th century. Usually against
17th century,
criminals that
okay.
were highway
That's-
robbers, grave thieves, or
that's
anyone
not
who would
that
try and
recent.
start a rebellion. This punishment would start by having a criminal lay flat on their stomachs with their arms tied behind their back. They would then be sliced open with a razor to increase the size of their backbone. And as soon
no.
as that incision was made, the cut would be lathered with paste to instantly stop the blood. They would then thrust in a long wooden stake that was the width of a man's arm, which was sharply tapered on one end. They then begin to hit the wooden
is he
stake with
enjoying
a
it?
mallet, pushing it further and further in. And of course, the steak was greased up beforehand to make this process a lot smoother. And once the steak has popped out of the criminal's shoulder, head, or mouth, they were pretty much long gone. He is then planted next to a busy road, like a Halloween decoration, to remind everyone that this is what happens when you break the law.
Was he just
They
left
would be
to
left
rot?
there for the entire day and removed the following morning before the body
never
begins to
mind.
stink. But wait, there's another version of this as well. You see, on some occasions, the criminals would only be impaled just deep enough to keep them in place, but not too deep that it would cause immediate death. They would
So
do
they
this
would
by having
stay
stakes that
alive.
had a seated position on them to prevent the person from sliding down any further. They would then be placed on a busy road where they would suffer for hours and hours, pleading to people walking by for help, until eventually succumbing to their wounds.
Human cruelty
Number
has no
5,
limits.
Poena culae. Poena culae is Latin for penalty of the sack. And that's
This is
exactly what it
Roman.
was. just a
I know
lot more
exactly what this
terrifying
is.
and cruel. This was an exclusive punishment for anyone that would murder their own family members.
Yup.
This was first seen in the 2nd century
Anyone
in
who
Rome,
committed
but would later be used by the
familicide, I think
Germans
that's
in
what
the
it was.
18th century. This all begins with a convicted murderer being placed inside a thick in the 18th century in the 2nd century in Rome, but would later be used by the
Rome.
Germans in the 18th century. This all begins with a
And
convicted
Germans.
murderer being placed inside a thick leather bag. But just to make sure the man isn't lonely, they would then add a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. I don't know what these animals did to deserve this, but hey, at least
Well,
the
they also
evil
threw
family
them into
murder
the sea
doesn't
after,
die
I
alone.
think.
Once all the animals are added inside the bag, it is then sewn shut, creating an almost airtight seal. Now you would think this would be horrible enough, but no. This is just the beginning, because as soon as the bag is sewn shut, it is then tossed into the ocean.
Yup.
But don't worry, later on, these murderers would be given the option to either be placed inside the leather bag or be sent to perform at the Colosseum, where they can perform the act of being mauled to death in front of all of their loved ones and peers. You know, at least they had the option. Number 4. Rats.
At least you
This
can
is
go
one of
out
the
on
most
your
sick
own
punishments
terms.
in all of human
Somewhat,
history,
kind
and it
of.
involves the use
Not
of rats.
really.
I will cover 2 of them here as they are very similar. The first use of
I'd
this
rather go
form
out
of
in the
punishment
Colosseum
dates
in a
back
blaze
to
of glory.
1568 during the 80 Years' War. A Dutch leader named Diederik Sonoy would often use this method of punishment, which involved placing
Oh, yeah,
a
it's-
rat
it's
inside
what I
of
was
a
talking
clay
about in the
bowl,
beginning.
then placing it topside down on a prisoner's stomach, chest, face, or groin.
The
Then the
face?
back of the bowl would be heated with either a torch
never heard of
or
that
some
version.
coals, causing the rat to go into a full-on panic, trying to escape from the heat. And its only way out was
And
to
it just
burrow
burrows
into
down
the human.
into the
Once
human.
inside, it would continue to chew and tear apart whatever was in its way, desperately searching for a way out. Eventually, the rat finds its way out of the maze.
Can't blame
and
the rat, it's
survives.
just trying to
The same
survive.
could not be said for the prisoner. But the second method was much, much worse, and was highly secretive since it was used under the guidance of the dictator Augusto Pinochet, where he held power from
That's a modern
1976 through 1983.
That's
They called
40
it
years
the
ago.
rectoscope. And I'm sure you have already figured out where this is going.
It goes up-
yes,
up-
it's exactly
up
what you
the-
think. They would place a tube on
Oh
a
my
prisoner's back
goodness.
door, then insert a rat inside of the tube. The rat would then begin to burrow its way in.
And this happened
These people were
40
so
years
sick
ago.
that they actually expected the prisoners to answer questions while this was going on. Eventually, the rat would find its way in and begin to move forward to find its way out. Nobody really knows how many people died from this punishment, but we do know that a ton of people went missing when this dictator was in charge. Number
Oh, well,
3,
that's great to
Gibbeting.
know.
The last known use was in the early 1900s in Afghanistan. This all came to light in 1921 when the National
Gibbeting.
Geographic published this image in their magazine. This was also used in the United States from time
So
to time
people were
during the
just
17th
stuck
and
in
18th
cages and
century.
left?
One notable example was in Boston, Massachusetts,
to
where
die
a few
from
pirates were
starvation?
hung at the Boston Harbor, which served as a warning to any sailors that were approaching Boston. Now let's talk about England, since they love this form of punishment so much. In England, this was used on traitors, murderers, pirates, and thieves. But after the year 1752, the Murder Act was passed, which required that all convicted murderers must be put to death by being publicly dissected or by gibbeting of some sort. And over 134 confirmed people met this fate.
Wow.
The most
Who came
common
up with
form of
that?
gibbeting were actually cages, and they looked like this. It was an all-steel cage
Oh my
that was
God.
shaped tightly to the form of a human body, which was so
And you
tight
just
that it would not
slowly
allow the person inside to
starve
move.
to death.
They were then hung 30 feet or more off the floor, usually on a public road or water hole, to ensure that the most amount of people could witness this monstrosity. But I can only assume this was more
You see this?
annoying than
This could happen
anything,
to you
since every time you
if
get
you
thirsty
commit a
and
crime.
needed to fill up your container of water, you would have to deal with the dying man begging you for a sip.
Over here!
But the annoyance and torture of the public didn't stop there, because after the criminals would die in the cages, the body would be left inside
They didn't
to
even
rot for
take
years
them
and
out?
years on end, with the locals
The
complaining that the
smell.
smell of death was so pungent
Oh.
that they couldn't even
Wouldn't that
sleep
cause
at night.
disease?
There's even been reports that some human remains stayed inside of these cages for over 20 years, before a government official would finally remember to clean it out. Number 2, scaphism. This was a form of punishment that was used by the ancient Persian Empire on anyone that would be
Scaphism.
convicted of murder. First, the criminal would be placed inside of a boat on their backs and tied down. The boat had 4 holes cut out so that the person's arms and legs would be outside of the boat and in the water. They were then force-fed large
What's the
quantities
purpose
of
of that?
honey and milk until their stomachs were visibly full. They would then proceed to lather their entire
that's gonna
body
cause
with the
diarrhea.
milk and honey as well. After all these steps were completed, he was then pushed out to the middle of the lake where he was completely exposed to the heat of the sun. But the sun would soon become the least of his worries.
And he's being
You
cooked
see,
alive,
the reason
too.
they fed him milk and honey was
that's
not
gonna
because it
attract
was a great
bugs.
last meal, but because this combination causes the person to get
And he's gonna be
extreme
slowly eaten by
diarrhea,
insects,
which
isn't
mixed
he?
with the sweet honey attracts rodents, bugs, wasps, bees, flies, and whatever other animals live near the lake. After being tormented by the animals throughout the entire night, you would think that the daytime maybe gets a little better. No.
This is just a
because
rat
as soon as the
dungeon,
sun
but
rises the following day,
10
the person
times
inside of
worse.
the boat gets another gigantic meal of milk and honey and an additional lathering. This would be done on a daily basis to prolong the punishment for as long as possible. It was also well
long
documented
could
that
this
the
last?
rodents would continuously attempt to burrow inside of the person through their back door. They were probably trying to get
no.
a head start on their next meal. A writer named John Sonaris wrote in great detail about one of these incidents. He would go on to say that it was one of the most horrid and cruel forms of punishment since it was terribly long and seemed to have no end in sight. He wrote about a man who survived for an entire 17 days before he finally died from his wounds.
17?
Apparently, the man spent his last few days with his entire face completely covered with wasps, and his flesh rotting away, filled with swarms of parasites and worms.
And he was still
all
somehow
while
alive
being
then,
covered
huh?
in his own filth. Number 1. The oubliette. Oubliette simply means to forget in French. This was a punishment that was used in many places throughout history, including in the London Tower, which had a small
So
and
they were
confined
once again
room
just dropped in a
called
cell and
Little
forgotten?
Ease. Not only was this room pitch black, it was also so small that prisoners could not sit, stand, or lay down while inside it, and they would be left in this uncomfortable position for days on end. One of the most famous oubliettes is not the one in the London Tower, but in the neighboring district of Warwick, inside of Warwick Castle. Here, deep underground in the castle's dungeons, is a very small and narrow cell, completely made of stone, which has a metal door to close it shut. Prisoners were tossed inside of the cell and forgotten about, as the name implies. The prisoner would just have to sit there and wait for their
take yourself
inevitable
out.
death, which usually came in a few days.
Bash your
from
head in against the
dehydration
wall.
or starvation. Now, of course,
end your
this would
suffering
be the
faster.
best case scenario, because in reality, most of the time there would already be a rotting corpse inside of the cell to keep the new prisoner company. The previous occupier of the cell would serve as a daily reminder of his upcoming fate. But that's not the only companions that he will have, since the underground
Rats,
dungeons are
yeah.
completely infested with rats
Oh,
that have
God.
developed a taste for human flesh. But wait, there's more. These oubliettes existed in many of the castles throughout Europe, and in recent times they have actually discovered these dungeons with dozens, if not hundreds, of human remains inside of it, as proof that they were hardly ever cleaned. Like in
Holy
Leap
shit.
Castle of Ireland, where in 1900, during the castle's renovation, a worker found a small opening behind a wall inside of the chapel. This hole had an 8-foot drop that led to a large oubliette, and what the worker found inside shocked him, since it was filled with so many skeletons that they needed multiple cartloads to clear it all out. But just when you think this section is over, it just keeps on giving. You see, there's been many stories of men
What
who
else
have been
is there?
placed inside one of these dungeons and kept alive for years and years on end, surviving off crumbs of food and minimal amounts of water, prolonging their inevitable
Why would you
demise
prolong
for
it?
as
Just-
long as humanly possible.
Just end it.
These cells were sometimes even placed on ground level so they can hear the voices and laughter of the people outside.
Wow,
An
so it's also
experience that
psychological
they will never
torture.
get again in this lifetime.
Yeah, if I was stuck in an oubliette, I would just keep bashing my head against the wall until I go to sleep forever. Because that is by far the best choice you could make in that scenario. Which one of these was the worst? It's very hard to decide which was the worst because they're all terrible. However, the last one, the oubliette, I think is one of the best ones because you can take yourself out. You have the choice to end yourself quickly without having to spend weeks, months, or maybe even years suffering. So that's not that bad. Pretty much all of these end in death, so the outcome is always the same. The only difference is how much you suffer before you die. So the oubliette can be the easiest one, just the least painful, because you can just finish yourself off. I think the worst one would have to be scaphism, the one where they just put you out on the boat with the honey and the milk. I personally think that one's the worst. I think it's the worst because it's the longest, except for maybe gibbeting. What's worse? Starving to death or being eaten alive by rats, insects, having constant diarrhea, being just destroyed by wasps? Yeah, I still think scaphism is worse than gibbeting. So yeah, I think number 2 is the worst one and number 1 is the best one. Hard to really point out a best one in this, but there it is. Well, anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you're interested, why not watch this video right here? And with that, I hope I'll see you in the next video.